Hello, it's Adam from the Tudor Chest here. If you enjoy these episodes, then perhaps you would consider becoming an official patron or subscriber to the channel, where you can access weekly additional subscriber-only episodes. In these weekly bonus episodes, I explore the lives of various figures from Plantagenet and Tudor history, folks who get less airtime but played a big part in history nonetheless, from Catherine of Valois to Eustace Chapuis, Sir Geoffrey Pole to Bess of Hardwicke. From as little as £5 a month, you can access all of these episodes either via my Patreon at patreon.com/The Tudor Chest or signing up via Apple Podcasts. Natalie Grueninger is a historian and author known for her incredible podcast series Talking Tudors. A couple of years ago, Natalie released her book, The Final Year of Anne Boleyn, which, as the title suggests, charts the final year of Anne Boleyn's life and how many of the seeds that eventually brought her down were sown long before May 1536. In writing this book, Natalie uncovered aspects of Anne's story that are either seldom explored, unknown, or massively misunderstood, from Anne's miscarriages, how her arrest played out, and indeed what happened to Anne's remains after she was beheaded. All of this, and much more, will be covered in this episode. Welcome back to the Tudor Chest podcast, episode 64, The Final Year of Anne Boleyn with Natalie Grueninger. Welcome to the Tudor Chest podcast, Natalie Grueninger. How are you?
I'm well, Adam. Thank you. Such an honour to be here chatting with you.
You're very welcome. So firstly, I'm just going to say, forgive me if I sound quite croaky. I've been getting over a head cold and this is the last bit, so my apologies if I do sound a bit croaky. But we're here today to talk about a book that you wrote that came out a couple of years ago, The Final Year of Anne Boleyn. Before we get into that, just a few get to know you questions, although you and I know each other quite well. So can you just provide me with a short intro into your background, so where you grew up and what you now do full time?
Yeah, absolutely. So if the accent hasn't given me away yet, I am a born and bred Sydney sider, proud Sydney sider, I should add. So I am an independent researcher. I'm a published author. I'm also a podcaster like you, Adam. I run the Talking Tudors podcast, and I specialize in the life and the reign of Queen Anne Boleyn. So she's always been the person that's kind of drawn me to the Tudor period, and I can't get away from her. I just keep, wanting to explore her life further. So I live here in Sydney in a lovely leafy suburb of southern Sydney with my husband and now 20-year-old and 16-year-old children, which is amazing how time flies. And I'm a bit of a digital educator, I suppose you could say, because I do run a lot of courses online and events, because the Tudors are loved all over the world. So I like to make these courses available to everyone. So that's also a big part of what I do. And this is my full-time work now, which is really exciting and has been for the last couple of years.
So was there something specifically, growing up that sparked your passion for Tudor history, and in particular the story of Anne Boleyn? Was there something that you can recall?
Yeah, it's interesting because I actually came to Anne Boleyn and the Tudors quite late because, of course, doing my education here, we don't study Tudor history as part of our curriculum. I've always loved the past, though. I have to say the past has always called to me. From, my very earliest memories are of me being fascinated by this idea that here where we walk now, other people lived their lives. Like, I always find that so intriguing, and this kind of cycle of life and death that just continues. But in terms of the Tudors, I can recall exactly what it was. My sister had become interested in the Tudor period before me, and she in fact lent me a book called The Secret Diary of Anne Boleyn by Robin Maxwell. And I remember thinking, okay, I'll give it a go. I wasn't much into historical fiction at that time, but was immediately hooked. It's this idea that Elizabeth gets a diary about her mother's life given to her. And from then on, honestly, I had to know absolutely everything that there was to know about the Tudors. I ended up going on my own to England not long after that and visited the Tower and Hampton Court. And that, of course, just fueled the fire because being an Aussie, I'd never seen a building that was built 1,000 years ago like the White Tower. So I was hooked, absolutely hooked. And that led me to eventually starting my website in 2009 on the Tudor Trail. That's where it got serious. That's where I devoted, a lot of time to studying this particular period. And it's always kind of been focused around Anne Boleyn.
I was thinking about it the other day. I think she is easily the most popular Tudor, total. I think she's more popular than Henry VIII. I think she's more popular than Elizabeth. I think Elizabeth's probably a close second, but I think Anne Boleyn is undoubtedly the most popular Tudor, I think.
Yeah, it's interesting, isn't it? Because she's still divisive. She still divides opinion, and people feel they've got strong opinions about her even now. And it's exactly like it was in the 16th century. So it hasn't really changed, which is quite interesting.
I know. I did something the other day out of curiosity. I looked how many, what the hashtag amount is for each of the six wives. And as you do on Instagram. And I think Anne Boleyn, basically, the other five wives combined was still less than Anne Boleyn, which was crazy.
Isn't that amazing? Amazing.
So I think I know what you're going to say to this question, but if you could pick a single moment from history to go back and witness, what would it be?
I might have to surprise you with this one, Adam, because I find, the big events, of course, there are so many big events that we might want to see, the Field of Cloth of Gold, Anne's coronation, but I would actually pick a quiet, normal, average day at Hever Castle when the Boleyns are all home so that I can kind of just see the interaction between them and just see what a typical family day was, see the interactions between Mary and George and Anne, her parents, her grandmother that lived with them for a time. I have to say, I think that would be what I would love to see.
I thought you'd say coronation.
Yeah, that's a close second.
Yeah, I mean, that's what mine would be. But that's such a really nice idea, actually, of just seeing them as they would have been when they were able to relax, I suppose, because I'm sure the coronation was anything but relaxing.
Absolutely.
So is there a Tudor misconception that you would love to change?
Oh, my goodness. There's so many. There are so many. But I think because the subject of our talk is, the final year of Anne Boleyn and her kind of downfall, I think one that I would love to be able to change is this idea that Thomas Boleyn, so Anne and George and Mary's father, should have and could have done something to help them in May 1536. People still look down on him, I suppose, because they have this idea that he turned his back on his children. In fact, that he fed them to the lions himself. I think this is so far from the truth, and the evidence we have, and there's not very much about Thomas Boleyn at this period of time, but I think the evidence we have suggests that he was heartbroken. He and Elizabeth were broken by this. And once you spend enough time at the Tudor court, you know that when Henry has decided to have your children executed, that there is absolutely nothing that you can do to help. And we don't know if he attempted to petition the king. We just don't have the evidence. We know that George was on his way to Whitehall when he was arrested. So almost certainly he was trying to get to the king to speak on behalf of Anne. Perhaps Thomas did the same thing and it just hasn't been recorded. Within, I think that the biggest piece of evidence is that within a few years, both he and Elizabeth are dead. This is a life-changing thing that's happened. It is absolutely appalling. Any parent listening would be able to understand. Can you imagine losing both your amazing children? They were just brilliant sparks, and the injustice of it and not being able to actually do a thing in order to help them. Gosh, I can't even imagine the horror of that.
I have to say, it's probably one of the very few things about the film The Other Boleyn Girl that I really love is that moment when Kristen Scott Thomas as Elizabeth Boleyn slaps her husband and sort of tries out my children, because that's, you can imagine that's probably what would have happened, and so I think that reaction was one of the best things about that film, actually, because it brings it home just that these were her children. They were their children,
It's absolutely heartbreaking and awful, there's no doubt about that.
We're here today to talk about, as I said, your book, The Final Year of Anne Boleyn. And as the title suggests, rather than focus solely on May of 1536, you explore the final year of Anne Boleyn's life in its entirety and how, in many ways, there were lots of things that had happened earlier that really began to break Anne down and sort of change the landscape of her queenship. I'd like to start by asking about the disastrous visit to the English court by Philippe de Chabot, the Admiral of France. Can you walk me through sort of what Anne and Henry were looking to get out of this visit and how they ended up getting a very rude awakening when he arrived?
Absolutely. This is a difficult episode to read for any Boleyn supporter. So yes, I cover in detail 1535 and 1536, but of course I need to venture into 1534 for different events to highlight certain things. And one of these is the visit you've just said. So Anne and Henry were under the impression that the purpose of the Admiral's visit was to renew amicable relations with France, and they were going to do this by negotiating a marriage. So a marriage between the Princess Elizabeth and the Dauphin, so Francis I's eldest son, also called Francis. Now, of course, they were excited by this because such a match would show that Francis supports not just their marriage, but that he also considers Princess Elizabeth to be the rightful heir and not the Lady Mary. So imagine, Adam, the surprise when in fact the Admiral proposes a match between the Dauphin and the Lady Mary. And Henry and Anne quickly find out that it appears that Charles is the one, so Charles V is the one who has in fact suggested this match. And of course, it implies that Mary has the better claim over Elizabeth, Anne's daughter. So it was a blatant and, hurtful insult. And things aren't made any better because Chabot, in fact, fails to show Anne the courtesy that her position requires. So he doesn't treat her very well at all. Now, Henry is, of course, angered by this. Anything that kind of humiliates him is not a good thing for Henry. So he responds with his own proposal, and he suggests that a marriage between the Princess Elizabeth and the Duke of Angoulême. So I think he was Charles, I think. So, but this is also received with kind of callous indifference. Now, even though things haven't gone well, you have to kind of follow tradition. So on the eve of the day before the Admiral departs back to France, they throw him a big party, essentially. Everyone's kind of there, Anne's there. Now, we see just how fragile Anne is at this point. Her emotional fragility just shines through because, according to Chapuis is the source for this, while she's dancing with the French envoy, Anne just bursts out laughing, kind of out of nowhere. And the Admiral, of course, thinks that Anne's laughing at him, but then she actually explains that no, she's not laughing at him. She's laughing because the king had actually told her that he was going to get the Admiral's secretary, a man called Palamédes Gontier, to come and kind of amuse her, entertain her. And then on the way, he runs into a beautiful lady and then forgets what he was doing in the first place. So Anne said she was in fact laughing at that. But when she next meets Gontier, and he comes back in, I think it's February 1535, to kind of go through these other negotiations, he reports that she's worried. She's really scared that loss of French support is going to be absolutely detrimental to her. And she urges him to persuade Chabot to act and to actually respond to the king's counter proposal because they'd pretty much been ignoring it, to be honest. So I think it's a very revealing event because it shows France's position quite clearly, but then it also shows how nervous and fragile Anne is at this point in time as well.
And I think this must have felt so personal. It must have felt like such a kick in the teeth because Anne was, such a Francophile. She loved all things French. She was all about the promotion of French interests. This must have been really upsetting and so infuriating for her.
Oh, absolutely. Like devastating. Devastating. If we remember that Anne, of course, spent her formative years in France, she made connections with people there. She was still corresponding with Francis's sister, Marguerite d'Angoulême. I think she probably spoke French with a slight French lilt. She was considered French. She loved French fashions. She often, her devotional texts were often in French. It was this sort of Frenchness, if we could call it that, with her exotic looks and her culture that, of course, attracted Henry in the first place when she arrived back from France in late 1521. And it's why he became so enamored with her. But now, with relations between the two nations kind of deteriorating, Henry's suspicion is mounting. This, being French, is a huge liability, and Anne is well aware of it. You know, we heard she told the Gontier that if things don't improve, she's in big trouble, basically. She knew it.
So another key figure who remained understandably resolutely against Anne Boleyn was, of course, her stepdaughter, the Lady Mary. And there was one notable exchange between the two women that occurred at Eltham, when, following a mass, Anne was advised that Mary had curtsied to her, and Anne then sought Mary out to thank her. But this was then massively thrown back in Anne's face. What happened here?
Oh God, I think you're picking all the difficult events here, Adam. So yes, I think we should to keep in mind that this is recorded in the life of Jane Dormer by Henry Clifford. Henry was an English Catholic who was very hostile to Anne and Elizabeth. It was started also after Jane Dormer actually dies in 1613, so it comes a little bit later. However, Jane did serve Mary.
So a pinch of salt is what you're saying.
Yeah, she did serve Mary. So it's possible that these recollections were actually given to her by Mary. So yes, it takes place in the chapel at Eltham Palace. So we think Anne and Henry are there visiting Elizabeth, as they often did, because the sisters were in the same household, Mary kind of serving Elizabeth. So they both hear mass and they curtsy at the end. And when Anne returns to her chambers, one of her ladies tells her that before Mary left the chapel, she'd made reverence to her. And so, of course, Anne is shocked. She says that she didn't see the gesture. If she had seen it, she would have returned it. And then she also says, and I quote, that the love of none should be dearer nor more respected than hers, and she would embrace it with the kindness of a true friend. So Anne was excited, thinking that Mary had finally shown her some respect. So she promptly sends one of her ladies over to the Lady Mary to let her know that she just hadn't seen the gesture. But when this woman walks in, she says to Mary, "The Queen salutes your grace." And then Mary apparently responded by saying, "Well, that's completely impossible because the Queen is too far away to salute me." Of course, she's referring to her mother, Catherine of Aragon. And then she says that she can't acknowledge any other queen but her mother, and that the reverence that she made was actually to the high altar, to her maker, to God, and to Anne's God. So the lady promptly leaves, returns to Anne, tells her what's happened. And of course, Anne apparently or allegedly vows to one day pull down this high spirit. So it didn't end well, that little meeting.
Yeah. Awkward, to say the least.
Awkward, very awkward.
So Mary was also very unwilling to show any real deference to her infant half-sister, Princess Elizabeth. I'm curious just to get your opinion on something, really, which is, how differently do you think Mary would have behaved had Elizabeth been a boy? Because this boy would have still been the son of Anne Boleyn, but do you think Mary would have still believed herself to be the true heir to England? Or if it was a boy, do you think she would have just gone, it is what it is, I'm going to have to show deference?
Yeah, I think it would have made it harder for her had it been a son. But to be honest with you, I think that Mary's grudge for Anne Boleyn never ceased. She hung on to it until her last day on, this earth. It's very well documented that she had a great anger for Anne. She blamed Anne for what had happened between her parents. And we know this. We see this, Adam, in Mary's first parliament, where she passes an act, of course, overturning all her father's acts in regards to the divorce and making herself legitimate. She doesn't name Anne within the act, but it's definitely Anne that's implied. She does, though, name Thomas Cranmer. She names him and says basically that it was Anne and Thomas Cranmer that poisoned the king's mind. It's never Henry's fault, is it? So I think this anger, this fury would have still been directed at a son. She would have seen him as completely illegitimate. She saw Anne Boleyn as a usurper of her mother's crown and as the cause of all her suffering that she endured, which I think we need to lay firmly at Henry's door. But of course, it's very difficult for Mary to blame her father, very difficult for anyone to blame the king. So Anne is a great scapegoat, and so is Thomas Cranmer, So I think it would have been more difficult if it had been a son, but I think her feelings would have remained the same. She would have firmly believed in her legal right to the throne, in her mother's queenship. So, but it is an interesting thing to actually, consider, I think.
Yeah. And it's so true what you say about that ultimately it was Henry VIII that was responsible for all of this. And I think that becomes so glaringly obvious following Anne's death. Mary's situation does not improve when Anne is killed. It only improves.
No, it actually gets worse, to be honest.
Yeah, it only improves when she signs her name to the Act of Supremacy and it acknowledges her own bastardy. That's when things change. There must have been a moment where she thought to herself, "Oh shit, okay, this was always my dad." Obviously, she couldn't vocalize that, but that must have been a moment.
I think she must have thought that privately. I really do. It's a difficult thing, of course, for someone to acknowledge that your father has done this.
She must have had to. It would have dawned on her.
I just feel like she must have at some point.
So around Christmas 1534, Anne Boleyn is believed to have miscarried. I know that there are 2, possibly 3 miscarriages, and little is known about this pregnancy, save that it ended in miscarriage. What do we know about this miscarriage? What was the initial fallout? Did Anne bounce back in Henry's favour relatively quickly?
Yeah, so this is a really interesting thing that I explored many, many years ago when Sarah Morris and I wrote In the Footsteps of Anne Boleyn, because we knew there was something more going on here to the usual, oh, she just miscarried. And it actually occurred in the summer of 1534, just to clarify. But we have from January 1534 hints that Anne is pregnant already by January 1534. So there are a set of instructions given to Nicholas Heath and Christopher Mont. They were going on embassy to the German princes. And Henry, it's a long sort of set of instructions, but basically Henry's praising Anne. And part of the praise is about her aptness to procreate children. So it seems that if she'd only had Elizabeth, that's a kind of strange thing to say. But if she was pregnant a second time, then that makes much more sense. By late January, anyway, 1534, we know because Anne's reported as being again in the family way. In February, Henry tells Chapuis that he's going to have a son very soon. By April, Anne's receiver general, George Taylor, is referring to Anne's goodly belly. She means like a big belly. End of June, Sir Edward Ringley tells Lord Lisle that the couple are merry, that they're happy, everything's going really well. And it's probably around this time, actually, that Henry orders an incredibly elaborate cradle from Cornelius Hayes. The receipt for the cradle was actually sadly undated, but I think, having looked at all the evidence, that it fits perfectly with it having been for this particular pregnancy. And we know as well that it's around this time that the Most Happy Portrait medal is struck. Now, only the prototype survives because, of course, tragedy ends up happening and doesn't have this baby. And what we know is on the 26th of June, they're merry. On the 2nd of July, the king leaves Anne behind at Hampton Court and moves to the Moor. They were rarely apart at this time. So this is an interesting thing that happens. They were also planning for a trip to Calais. And the king orders the Duke of Norfolk and other people to come to him to the Moor. They have a bit of a discussion, a meeting, and the trip to Calais is postponed or cancelled. They send George Boleyn post-haste to the King of France to tell him that unfortunately, because of Anne's advanced pregnancy, she's not able to travel, so they need to postpone the meeting to the following year. What happens after that, we just don't know. All we know is that the whole thing is swept under the carpet. But I think we need to remember that by this point, Francis already has 3 sons. So this is, I think what's happened here is they're just trying to save face. The couple reunite after about a month. So I think it's early August. They're back together. Nothing more is said of the pregnancy until September 1534, when Chapuis reports a rumor that Anne hadn't been pregnant at all. And there's this idea later that some historians have gone with about a possible false pregnancy. Now, when I looked into this, it didn't seem to fit Anne's situation. They're very sort of set of sort of traumas and real longevity in not being able to have children that seems to, it's still the kind of condition that's not very well known even today. But Anne had Elizabeth in September 1533. By November, probably, she's pregnant again. So she really didn't have need to be stressing about whether she can conceive or not, but she conceived really quickly. And the pregnancy goes, as far as we know, until the late June, probably. So I think
very far gone.
Yeah, I think it's a stillbirth. And I think because they were at Hampton Court, almost certainly born. They're the child. We don't know anything else about that at all. But there is one little further piece of evidence that I just want to mention. In February 1535, a woman has gotten into trouble because she's been saying unpleasant things about the king and Anne. And she claims that Anne had had a child by the king, which was dead born. So this appears to be a reference to the stillbirth of 1534 that was probably swept under the carpet, but of course got out, and people knew about it.
Yeah.
So it's a tragic event, another tragic story. It doesn't seem to have any direct effect on Henry and Anne's relationship. They're back together within a month, as I say, but that was the longest time they'd been separated since they'd kind of started their relationship, apart from when Anne was sick with the sweating sickness, so it was, it's interesting to think what that caused in Henry's mind.
Yeah, and if you're right, which I'm sure you are, that, she fell pregnant around November, she miscarried in the summer, we're looking at a window of potentially 8 months gestation. That's almost full term.
Yeah.
So, I didn't realise that she'd had a pregnancy that had gone on that long.
It's so difficult, isn't it? It's really heartbreaking. And I think this exacerbates the issue with Mary Boleyn, because not long after Anne has a stillbirth or loses her baby, Mary Boleyn turns up at court very visibly pregnant to announce that she's married without the Queen's permission. So I think Anne's treatment of her, getting kind of rid of her sister or sending her away from court, was probably because she was triggered. She'd just lost her baby, and there Mary appears heavily pregnant. Unfortunately, it appears that Mary loses that baby herself, but we don't have much details about that particular event. But there's just so much loss going on. It's really heartbreaking.
So in October of the next year, so 1535, Anne discovers that she's pregnant again. Was there any sense that for Anne, this kind of felt like the last throw of the dice? Or is that, I suppose, putting emphasis on something because we know, is that using hindsight as such?
Yeah, it's difficult not to read this through with hindsight, isn't it? I think that she may have been a little bit nervous by then already, because if we think that it was the summer of 1534 that she loses that baby, and she's only pregnant now in, as you say, around October 1535. So this is when they've returned from that wonderful progress that they go on, where they seem to have reunited and suddenly spent a lot more time together, which hence why she's pregnant. So there's no direct evidence for her thinking that this is it, there's her final chance. And I suppose, and what we do know, what there is evidence for, is that unfortunately this baby is lost as well. She miscarries this baby. We do know that in January, late January. Yeah. And after that miscarriage, there is a report of her ladies being distraught, being absolutely heartbroken for her, and of her, in fact, comforting them and saying, that's okay. This was God's will and it was meant to be. And I'll soon fall pregnant again with a son. So even after this third pregnancy, I should say, she is still hopeful according to this account. So, I don't think she could have imagined what was coming, and no one could have imagined. This was completely just unprecedented, absolutely unprecedented. And I think we have to always keep that in mind when we're looking at this story, that we're not going backwards from what we know.
So it's long been believed that on the day Catherine of Aragon is buried, that's the day that Anne miscarried this child, and that the pregnancy was sufficiently far along enough for it to be determined that it was a boy. However, I believe that you've discovered that this was likely not the case, and that Anne actually miscarried on another day. Is that true? And what's the evidence to support this?
Yeah, well, I think the evidence definitely points to us having to at least consider that it didn't happen on the 29th. I don't think it happened on the day of Catherine's funeral. Okay. I think that's a bit of a kind of morality tale that was told, and this is what is Chapuis told, to sort of show that Catherine is the rightful queen, the righteous queen, and Anne is a sinful woman, and look how God's, responded to her pregnancy. So what we know, this is basically the evidence. We know that Chapuis on the 10th of February reports that Anne miscarried on the day of Catherine of Aragon's funeral, which was on the 29th of January. He says she miscarried of a male child of about 3.5 months old. So this is the first that we hear of this miscarriage, and it comes on the 10th of February, 1536. Now, Charles Risley, which reports lots of things during the Tudor period, he reports the miscarriage as well. But he says that it actually occurred on the 30th of January, and he says that the Queen believed herself, so he had information somehow from Anne, that she was about 15 weeks pregnant at the time. the slight discrepancy in the dates, I think, might point to the fact that Anne did not have a spontaneous miscarriage, that in fact she may have suffered a long miscarriage. And I think it's likely that she started experiencing these symptoms not long after the king has his accident while he's training in the tilt yard, which happened on the 24th of January. Chapuis himself later actually reports that Anne blamed the miscarriage on the scare she got when she was told about the king's fall. Now, I think all of this is supported by a letter that Chapuis sends on the 29th, so on the day that this supposedly all happened. He sends a report and he says, and I'm just going to read this to you, Adam, because I think it's quite important. So he says, this very morning, someone coming from the lady mentioned in my letter of the 21st of November, he's talking about Gertrude Courtenay, Marchioness of Exeter, and also from her husband, has stated that both had heard from the lips of one of the principal courtiers that this king had said to one of them in great secrecy, and as if in confession, that he had been seduced and forced into this second marriage by means of sortileges and charms, and that owing to that he held it as null. God, he said, had well shown his displeasure at it by denying him male children. He therefore considered that he could take a third wife, which he said he wished much to do. Now, at the time of writing this on the 29th, Chapuis doesn't know what's triggered this. He doesn't know why the king's now saying he could take a third wife. But I think we can be fairly confident that it was the fact that Anne had miscarried or was in the process of miscarrying. I don't think Henry would have complained about no male heirs if the pregnancy was going well. Now, according to this story, Henry confesses to a principal courtier who then presumably tells another principal courtier all the conversations overheard by another principal courtier, who then tells the Exeters, who then dispatched their messenger from Greenwich to London to tell Chapuis what's happened. So I think that for this all to be, Chapuis to be reporting this and saying that information came to him on the morning of the 29th, we have to consider that Anne may have already miscarried, or that she was in the process of miscarrying. I really do think it was told, and I think Chapuis was told that it happened on the 29th because, this is just another way of showing sinful Anne, and we've just kind of repeated it for hundreds of years.
Yeah, I mean, it's got to get through a lot, based on what you've just said, it's got to get through a lot of people before it gets to Chapuis.
It does.
And that would suggest that's going to, it's not like nowadays where you send an email out,
No, he's not going to just send a text saying, guess what? Guess what? Henry wants a third wife in a quick text, or he's not going to, catch a quick Uber over from Greenwich to where Chapuis is. Like, I think these things took time. And it may have been the day before, who knows? But I just think we have to consider, especially with Risley's report of it happening on the 30th, that there is some discrepancy as to the date. It's not just set, a firm thing. Yes, it happened on the 29th, and miscarriages tragically are not always spontaneous. So we have to consider that as well. Yeah. And it does feel so neat that there's almost that morality tale aspect to it, as you say. It feels too convenient in my eyes, absolutely too convenient. Yeah. Either way, and she does miscarry, and if, what Henry is said to have said is genuine, would you say that this is where the wheels come off, and this is where Henry is seriously thinking, okay, I need to find a new wife? Yeah, I think we definitely get a shift in the trajectory here. And there's lots of those moments where you can see it shift, the story change. And I think this is one of them. And I think in order to better understand that, we just need to keep in mind that January was an absolute disaster. It was a disaster month, especially for Anne. It begins with the death of Catherine of Aragon, which at first glance may appear to be a great thing. Hey, Catherine of Aragon's dead. Henry is, telling everyone now there's no danger. He's partying, he's having a great time, and very quickly realizes that her safety net is gone. With Catherine alive, Henry could not annul his marriage to Anne, because then he's going to be expected to return to Catherine. And anyway, then it's going to be almost a recognition of the Pope's authority. Hey, Pope was right, Charles V was right, Catherine of Aragon was right, I should never have married Anne. The king's never going to do that. He doesn't admit to mistakes. According to Henry, he doesn't make mistakes. But, so Catherine of Aragon's death opened up all these new possibilities for Henry. His accident that he has on the 24th of January when he falls off his horse, it's a great big embarrassment. He's not in a tournament. He's not competing. He just has a fall doing an act that he's done practicing, running at the ring. He's done this since he was a kid. He's fallen in front of all his courtiers, all the principal courtiers, actually. Lots of those men end up on the scaffold very soon. So you have to also wonder about that connection, the humiliation, and then the punishment that comes after. But so Henry can't joust anymore. He's vulnerable. Obviously he's feeling really wounded by that. Then Anne Boleyn unfortunately miscarries their baby. It was looked at the time as a kind of a dishonor. I know it's awful to say, but it was. It was almost like this is a stain on Henry's manhood, his manliness, and it comes just days after he's embarrassed himself in the tilt yard. So things are very, difficult at this moment. Anne is very vulnerable. Henry is feeling diminished by all these things. He is at his most dangerous when he's feeling diminished, when he's feeling inadequate. He will lash out to try and prop himself up because his ego is just so huge. So I think...
Yeah, that's when he's at his most dangerous.
Oh, yes. And that same letter, I didn't mention, that same letter where Chapuis reports that Anne miscarriages is our first mention of Jane Seymour as well. So surprise, surprise, at this time where Henry's feeling, that he's not manly enough, privately, obviously, he decides to start courting another lady. So it all sort of comes together.
So a few months later, on the 18th of April, 1536, Chapuis, who we've been discussing, is finally, let's say, forced into showing deference to Anne Boleyn following quite a carefully choreographed interaction, which essentially ensured that the ambassador came before Anne Boleyn. Until this point, he'd always managed to avoid actually meeting her. The 18th of April, this is literally a month and a day before Anne is executed. The fact that Henry VIII and Anne and Anne's family, I assume, orchestrate this, would suggest that even at this stage, Henry's still championing her. Would you agree, or do you think it's more, in some respects, Chapuis is the last person to knock down, and once he's done that, he's almost free of Anne, if that makes sense?
Yeah, that does make sense. Actually, I'm so glad that you didn't use the word tricked there, Adam. He was not tricked into acknowledging Anne Boleyn. It was simply that the king and queen were at the chapel and Chapuis was there. And of course, he has to show her reverence that, he's a very well-versed ambassador and knows exactly what he has to do. But interestingly, what's rarely reported is that he actually says that she was quite nice, and that he showed her reverence. She turned around and returned the reverence. So there was this exchange there. And it does, of course, Anne probably thought, wow, this is finally an acknowledgement from the imperial side, which she's never had. But in terms of what I think that means, I have to say, Henry, there's only one person, Adam, that Henry champions, and that's Henry. And I think this is another perfect example of Henry championing himself. Henry's mind is such that he believes that it is everybody's God-given duty to carry out his will, whatever that be. Whatever that may be, that is what you have to do. And this goes for wives, best friends, people he's known his whole lives, other kings and queens of other countries. You just have to do what Henry says. He cannot stand any show of defiance. So all I think this is basically Henry just wanting them to do what he had originally said, which was to accept Anne. I don't think this suggests that he wanted to stay in the marriage with Anne. I don't think this suggests he still loves her or anything like that. And I think it becomes quite clear that that's not the case. This is about Henry's ego. This is about Henry wanting Charles V to finally accept, this marriage, even when he knows full well that it's about to go really downhill, but he doesn't care. He just wants the acceptance. That's what I think it is.
Yeah, I can't remember which historian it was, but there was a documentary on about 10 years ago now that featured loads of historians, Susanna and Hilary Mantel and so on. I think it was Hilary Mantel. She said that she thinks that in some respects, Chapuis showing reverence to Anne was, as I sort of said a moment ago, that was kind of the last stop for Henry. Now that this last sort of enemy, for want of a better word, has been made to show Anne deference, that in a way it kind of frees Henry thereafter. He can let her go because that last irritating person who's not acknowledged what Henry wanted has had to do that, if that makes sense.
Yeah, and I think it's beautifully depicted in Wolf Hall, isn't it? That moment,
Yeah.
actually. It's such a great moment. And I
Yeah, because
think
he
it's
he
plausible.
turns around and George and Thomas Boleyn are
Yeah.
sort of on elbows out.
I don't like that. I have to say, I don't like that thing. I don't think that
Right.
happened whatsoever. I think Chapuis just acknowledged her because he'd come face to face with her. And what are you going to do? There's nothing else you can do. But what I like is that it does imply that this was the last hurdle for Henry in terms of his marriage with Anne, and that once that was kind of ticked off, and that, of course, Cromwell is involved in that in the fictional depiction. But, I think it's plausible that Henry wanted to
Yeah.
tick that one off his list before he moved on to his kind of next
Yeah.
step. Like, that makes
Yeah.
sense knowing Henry.
Just days later, on the 29th of April, a very famous exchange is said to have taken place between Anne Boleyn and Sir Henry Norris. Walk me through this, and why was this exchange, if it happened, so explosive?
Yeah, well, we think it definitely did happen because Anne reports it, talks about it when she's kind of come a bit undone when she's imprisoned in the Tower. So it either happened late on Saturday, the 29th of April. Again, this was a nightmare weekend, or early on Sunday, the 30th of April. So Anne comes into contact with Sir Henry Norris. We don't know exactly, what happened. Sir Henry Norris is Henry's groom of the stool, very privileged position, great power and influence. And she accuses him essentially.
And a great friend of Henry VIII's. They were really close.
A great, a great friend of
Well,
Henry VIII.
as close,
Exactly. As close as friend as you can be with a monarch, I think, and with Henry VIII. But exactly. So, and she essentially accuses him of having delayed his marriage to her cousin, Madge Shelton, or Margaret Shelton, because he wanted to marry her instead. So she actually says, "You look for dead men's shoes, for if aught came to the king but good, you would look to have me." Now, as soon as these words are out, Norris just sort of says, if I had any thought like that, then my head should be chopped off. He basically says that. And this only seems to anger Anne, who sort of tells him that she can undo him if she wants to. Now, she says that, and within a very short time, sanity descends again. And she sends him immediately to her almoner to say that she's a good woman, to confess that nothing's happened between them. But of course, this is a court where everyone is watching each other constantly. And the damage was instantaneous, absolutely instantaneous. And if we recall the act, the 1534 Treason Act, just imagining the king's death is actually high treason. So Anne, completely unwittingly, I think she was just so nervous. Her nerves were frayed by this point. She knew something was going on. She just didn't know exactly what it was.
Yeah.
She had a moment of insanity and basically handed Cromwell and Henry the ammunition which was to take her down. So it's just such an awful, awful incident that occurs.
It's kind of like the Tudor equivalent of sending a bitchy WhatsApp to the person you're bitching about, or an email to the wrong person. So,
it's really awful.
Yeah. And it also, to your point a moment ago about the 1534 Treasons Act, it does actually mean that Anne is technically guilty of treason.
Well, yeah, what happens is this is obviously when this forms part of the indictment, and we'll talk about that in a little bit, but basically the important thing for the Crown is to show that Anne's behavior, this kind of outrageous, she's sexually voracious. She's about to be accused with having adultery with 5 men, including her own brother. This has to be connected to some physical damage within Henry. And when we get to the indictment, Adam, I'll actually tell you how they did that.
Well, we can go on to that now. Anne Boleyn is arrested just days later. Is it true that she was watching a tennis match when the summons came to present herself?
You know what? I've never seen anything to support that. If anyone's listening and actually knows where that story originated, like the original source, I would so love to hear it, because everyone I asked, nobody had a clue. It's just been repeated time and time again. I can't answer that one, Adam. I didn't include it because I did not find one bit of contemporary evidence to prove that that's what she was doing.
She is arrested. What are the specific charges that are laid against Anne Boleyn?
Yeah, so we actually have the indictment. So, it's a very lengthy document, so I'm not going to go through the whole thing. But basically, essentially, she's accused of multiple counts of adultery with Henry Norris, William Brereton, Francis Weston, and Mark Smeaton. She's also accused of incest with her own brother, George Boleyn. importantly, crucially for the Crown's case, she's also accused of conspiring the king's death. And she's, of course, found guilty of all these charges. Now, just to give you a bit of an idea of the language that's used in what is traditionally a very formulaic document, which is written in Latin, but you're going to see how it diverts in this particular case, because here's an example. It was claimed that she followed, as in Anne, daily her frail and carnal lust, and did falsely and traitorously procure by base conversations and kisses, touchings, gifts, and other infamous incitations, divers of the king's daily and familiar servants to be her adulterers and concubines, so that several of the king's servants yielded to her vile provocations. So within the language of the indictment is the implication that she's already guilty. Do you know what I mean? So this veers from the usual formulaic kind of just official language to painting Anne as this kind of psychotic woman that can't control her sexual impulses. And it goes on. So apart from committing adultery, it's also alleged that she'd encouraged the men with gifts. I always have to have a bit of a giggle at this because she's accused of doing this twice. Once was New Year's Eve, 1535. Now, if you know the Tudor court, you know that the Queen has to give gifts on New Year's Day. This is a requirement. So this is just kind of silly. But it also states that she plotted with them the death and destruction of the king, and that she'd affirmed that she'd never truly loved the king in her heart and promised to marry one of them once Henry was dead. So according to Chapuis, both Anne and George were also charged with having laughed at the king's dress and at certain ballads that the king had composed. I actually think if there's anything true here, that was true. He also stated that Anne was accused of poisoning Catherine of Aragon and of planning to poison the Lady Mary. However, those charges don't actually feature on the indictment. It's only Chapuis that mentions them, so they may not have been actually part of it. Well, they weren't part of it. So it's really interesting how even before she's tried, there's no evidence, there's no witnesses, there's no testimonies. The indictment paints her as absolutely and completely guilty.
I mean, the language used, by modern standards is not particularly colourful necessarily, but then, it's almost deliberately pornographic. And I suppose the problem for Anne Boleyn was this is a woman who massively overturns the status quo. Not necessarily, as we sort of said earlier, Henry VIII is ultimately responsible for everything, but the extreme irregularity of Anne's position, the fact that, she is the one that is via her that Catherine of Aragon is overthrown. So almost the extreme nature of the charges, I suppose, in a way, stacks up for people when they consider this is a woman who has, to them, gone so against the grain that it's believable, I suppose, to them. And in a way, the more because the charges are so extreme, that almost adds more weight to them, if that makes sense.
Yeah, it does make sense. I know exactly what you're saying. She was vulnerable to these charges. So I've often thought that had Catherine of Aragon, let's say, just for example, had that same conversation with Sir Henry Norris for some reason, it would have been probably not even thought of. It would have just been like, whatever, because Catherine's reputation was completely unsullied. There was no question about her legitimacy, her right to her throne, whereas Anne is essentially the other woman. So these charges are believable. They're plausible. But I think what happens is that Henry indeed takes them a step too far, and it sort of ventures into the realm of farcical, because not only does he say that these were the charges, but he then goes off partying and telling people that no, she's actually slept with 100 men. She's committed adultery. And I'm sure that Thomas Cromwell was just like, oh my goodness, what are you doing? Because the whole case that they'd engineered, people were starting to doubt and question the veracity of what they were saying. So it's a really interesting balancing act. But because Henry is such a performer, he got into the role and he was loving it. He's like, oh, I'm a wounded husband and this is what's happened. But, so it's really quite interesting. And maybe, do you want me just to touch on the actual importance of some of the wording of the indictment in terms of the treason?
Yes, absolutely. Yeah.
Yeah. So you asked me before about this incident with Norris and whether that in fact then means that she is technically guilty of treason. I suppose it does, because they were talking about apparently the king's death. However, crucially, what the Crown tried to do and what they did was make a connection between these abominable crimes that Anne has committed and the men and physical harm actually coming to Henry. So what we see quoted later on, I'll read it to you. It says that the king, having within a short time before become acquainted with the before mentioned, so they go through all the crimes, vices, and treasons, had been so grieved that certain harms and dangers had happened to his royal body. So it was said that they'd committed these crimes in contempt of the king and to the danger of the king's person and body and to the scandal, danger, detriment, and derogation of the issue and heirs of the said king and queen. So they have now connected. If the imagining Henry's death wasn't enough, what they've done now is said these terrible crimes, when Henry found out, they physically harmed him. Now, that is 100% high treason. So it's a very clever way that the Crown has kind of put these crimes together, but then crucially connect, because adultery in the Queen wasn't high treason. That wasn't a crime at this point.
Yeah, that's always shocked people, doesn't it? That that aspect technically wasn't a crime.
No. So the conspiring Henry's death is crucial to this case. And that's why they make it so lurid and so salacious, because it has to cause physical harm to Henry when he finds out.
Yeah, and I mean, what's remarkable about this really is that, you know, we can look at all of the dates that she has supposedly slept with Norris or Weston or Brereton. You know, I think something like 75, 80% we can immediately say, well, that's impossible because she wasn't at this place you're saying she slept with these men, which makes you think there must have been this moment where Cromwell almost sat down with a pen and paper and was like, right, we can say she was there. Would that work? You know, she could have been there. She could have been there. She could have been there. It's that made up that there would have had to have been a chat where they figured out, what lies can we tell? Yeah. If that makes sense. Yeah. Do you know what I mean, though? Like, it's so made up that it's absurd.
It is infuriating. And I have an appendix of in my book actually sets out all the dates, and I went through and checked all the dates, something that Anne wasn't able to do at her trial, or George, and have found that in most cases, some do align, but in most cases, either Anne wasn't at the location, or the man wasn't at the location, or she'd just given birth, or she just had a miscarriage. Like, you know, ridiculous to think that a woman's going to be wanting to have sex with 5 men after she's just miscarried a child, those sorts of things. And you're right, there is such an insensitivity and such a kind of no care given about whether this makes any sense. You know, if someone checked the dates, how are they going to do it? How are you going to check? Nobody's going to do it. There's no defense when you're accused of high treason in Tudor times. You actually don't know all the charges until you get to trial. So there is, you know, it's impossible to put up a defense to that. She would not have been able to answer that and remember where she was exactly on all those days and who was there. Same with George. That didn't matter. All the Crown needed to show was that had caused Henry grievously bodily harm, you know, which is treason.
And I mean, that was the other big thing at the time, wasn't it? That, you know, where today we operate under a system of innocent until proven guilty, it was flipped. You know, at the time you were guilty until proven innocent. So obviously Anne is tried. She's found guilty on the 15th of May, 1536. Her brother George directly follows her. Although sentenced to death, and you know, she's sentenced by her own uncle, the Duke of Norfolk, to be either burned or beheaded at the king's pleasure. But Anne soon declares that she was in hope of life. So what happened to make Anne think that she might get a reprieve?
Yeah, so we essentially know about things that occurred during her imprisonment because Sir William Kingston is reporting everything to Cromwell. So he's keeping, you know, basically a diary of everything that's going on and sending it to Cromwell. And so we hear from Kingston that on the 16th, so the day after Anne's trial, she has a visit. Now, we don't know that people were allowed to visit Anne apart from Cranmer. He does visit. So the only visits were to do with her sort of spiritual side and spiritual healing and all that sort of thing. So he visits her, and it's thought that he visits to get her to confess to some sort of impediment to the marriage. So this is Thomas Cranmer. We don't know exactly what was said between them, but as you've mentioned, that day at dinner, Anne tells Kingston that she's going to go to a nunnery and that she's in fact in hope of life. So it does appear that Thomas Cranmer offered Anne some sort of deal, you know, agree to this annulment and your life will be spared. What I wonder, Adam, is whether Cranmer knew that Henry was not going to go through with his promise. That's what I would love to know that. So we know that this is probably what the conversation was about because Anne says she's in hope of life, and the next day her marriage to Henry is annulled. Cranmer annuls the marriage due to some very just and lawful impediments. Now, according to Risley, Anne confessed having been pre-contracted to Henry Percy, the Earl of Northumberland, a claim that the Earl himself had vehemently denied just days earlier. But Chapuis, on the other hand, says that the marriage was annulled because the king had been with Mary Boleyn before. But anyway, it doesn't matter. Either way, Henry's now a free man. He's now able to take a new wife and thought that this might save her. But I think she quickly realizes that that's not the case.
I think Cranmer's visits in particular are so important when we assess Anne's time in the Tower, and ultimately I think her innocence comes through, particularly and I was chatting about this actually last week with Sandy Vasoli, and I think, the fact that Anne swears both before and after taking the Eucharist that she is completely innocent of all charges is actually irrefutable proof that she was telling the truth. I mean, we know she was innocent, of course we do, but this is a woman who absolutely believed in heaven and hell, absolutely believed that her words spoken on earth would have an impact on whether she went to heaven or hell. You're not going to muck about with your immortal soul when you've been sentenced to death. So her, swearing on the Bible that she's innocent is irrefutable proof, I think. And I think Cranmer would have known that. And, obviously he couldn't necessarily report that back to Henry VIII, but I think it's really important that we keep that in mind.
Oh, absolutely. And it does get out. Anne's story changes because of what you've just said. So I like to think of it as the kind of equivalent of a modern day lie detector test. You've said, she's about to face her maker. She's not going to go to her death with a lie on her lips. I really don't believe that she would do that. And Chapuis has a spy among the women looking after Anne. We don't know who it was. We can kind of guess, but I'm not going to guess to confuse the matter, but he definitely has a spy. So the spy sees Anne make those last confessions and reports it straight to Chapuis, which is actually a great thing because then Chapuis reports it in his letters and we know that he knows about it and that other people know that Anne has said that she's done nothing. She's not guilty of any of those charges, that the king's accused her of. So it's a real... I'm just so glad that information actually gets out because, as you say, if Kingston reports it to Cromwell, Cromwell's not going to want that information to come out. Absolutely not, because that is proof, I think, of Anne's innocence, especially to a 16th century audience, where religion is everything. It dictates every hour of your day, it dictates what you eat, what you do, your behavior. So I think that's so true. It's a very important moment, and I'm just glad that Chapuis reports it. It's great.
Yeah, absolutely. And ironic, really, because, this is the man who, called her the concubine and the whore, but actually we've got a lot to thank for Chapuis in many respects. Yeah. So obviously we know, no reprieve came, and on the morning of the 19th of May, Anne is beheaded. This is one of the most well-known parts of Anne's story, so we won't go into the details here because people know, generally speaking, what played out. But there are a couple of things that I want to talk to you about relating to the execution. And the first is the fact that Anne is executed by sword. To the best of my knowledge and belief, this is the only time a sword is used to behead somebody in Tudor England. Do you have any sense on why this was selected? Did Anne ask for it? What is your theory on that particular question?
Yeah, it's really interesting. And I did try to see if there were other examples of it used in England. I couldn't really find it. We know this is the common form of execution in France at the time, which is interesting given the French link. So you can probably make some suggestions as to why Henry utilized it. But what we know is that on the 18th, the king issues a writ from Westminster to say how Anne's going to be dispatched, because you might remember at the trial it was kind of left open. She might be burned or, she might be dispatched in another way. So he writes to William Kingston and essentially he tells him, moved by pity, we don't wish Anne to be burned. We want her to instead have her head cut off. So there's this swordsman from Calais that is called to do the deed, and Kingston's quite confident he can do it well with little pain for Anne. Was it genuine pity that moves Henry to commute her sentence, or was it some sort of chivalric fantasy? Let's remember that Henry, the role player, Henry is an actor. He's taken on this role. It is imperative that he comes out of this looking good. He has to be seen in the best possible light as a wronged prince, but not a wrong prince. So his actions can't be wrong, but he has been wronged by Anne. And I know Sarah Gristwood had this fantastic suggestion that this might have to do with the fact it's all linked with this idea of chivalry, and that it was, in fact, this code that brought Anne and Henry together in the first place, and that now it's what divides them. I think it has to do with Henry's just being this seasoned role player, and that during her, their courtship, he'd taken on this role as courtly suitor. He loved it. And as Sarah says, he'd morphed from Lancelot the wooer to Arthur the wounded. We don't have any evidence of this being something Anne requested. Maybe she did, also, but we don't know.
It wouldn't also, like, the timing would be off, wouldn't it? Because wasn't the executioner sent for before Anne even went to trial?
Well, exactly, because he has come a long way. So it's the timing's off. It's all a bit. So I think it's, again, my personal opinion is I think this is Henry again showing just what a lovely king he is. Yes, he's killing his wife, but look, he's doing it in this incredibly merciful way. And of course, it was more merciful than the axe. We know that because the axe at least took 3 swings before your head was fully severed. It's pretty horrific. Of course, the sword is just as violent and brutal, but he would have seen it, and the 16th century audience would have seen it as a more merciful option, which in the end just ends up making Henry look good, really. There have been other suggestions that it may have been as a sort of as a kind of payback to Anne, who was so French, in style, that he's kind of throwing it back in her face. Hey, you're so French, so you can get executed with the French, in the French style. I don't know. There's no real direct evidence, so we can kind of just decide what each of us thinks.
Yeah, I've always been. I've sometimes wondered if Henry actually also thought to himself, I know she's innocent, so I will organise a method of execution that is more assured, cleaner, because we also have to consider this is not a kindness that is extended to Catherine Howard 5 years later, when her guilt was much more assured. So that is, I've often thought about that and wondered, was this Henry actually saying, look, to himself, I suppose, I know she's innocent, really, I know she's innocent. But again, who knows? We're never going to get.
I know, it's very difficult.
So the other thing that I wanted to ask you about is that it's long been believed, something I firmly believed, because what I've been told was that Anne was buried in a spare arrow chest, that no coffin had been provided. You believe otherwise, I believe. So where does the arrow chest story come from, and what has led you to believe that actually she was buried in a normal coffin?
Yeah, and maybe just at the outset to say that it's still possible that she was buried in an arrow chest. But what I'd like to suggest is that there is another possibility, and a possibility that is grounded in contemporary evidence as well. So I think we need to take it into consideration. You're right. That story's been told so many times. It's just kind of embedded in the story of Anne Boleyn. Everyone knows, she was buried in an arrow chest. But what's really interesting, Adam, when I started to look into this, I was quite surprised. So the story is from an old diary or a journal of one Mr. Anthony. He was surveyor of the ordnance at the Tower of London.
It's such a good name because it's just so stupid.
Yeah, Mr. Anthony. Isn't there something like don't trust people who have first names as surnames or something? I don't know. There's some story with people that have 2 first names. Anyway, Anthony is a real person, does work at the Tower of London, is the surveyor of ordnance, was an eyewitness to this. So that's all looking really good, isn't it, for the arrow chest story? But what modern historians rarely actually talk about, because it's probably not in your best interest when you're trying to put an argument forward, is that this diary is lost. It's been lost for centuries. And we only know bits of information from the marginal notes that were made by one Thomas Turner in his 17th century copy of The Life and Reign of King Henry VIII by Herbert of Cherbury. So this man presumably had access to Anthony's diary, his original, read it, took down some notes that he thought were interesting and put them in his book. And we have got that book. And I looked at those notes. So according to his annotations, he talks about quite a lot of different things, but he says that as soon as Anne's head was smitten off, he says, her remains were wrapped in a linen sheet and they were carried into the chapel within the tower. Her clothing was removed, and there, the crucial part, she was placed in a chest of elm wood designed to transport bows into Ireland. And then she was buried at the high altar at midday, according to his notes. Now, we don't have the original diary, so it's impossible to verify his recollections. We don't know. Did he think to just embellish the story as he was writing his notes down to make it more interesting? We just can't verify the story. And that story is carried on, and it's later embellished in books in the 20th century, including one very popular one by G.J. Younghusband, which is called The Tower from Within. It's published in 1918, and there it has like Anne's ladies are distraught, and this very nice warder comes and says, "Don't worry, it's fine. She doesn't have a coffin. I'll go and get this box," So the story just continued. But there is a contemporary Italian account, possibly I think written by a Venetian diplomat, that in fact states that Anne's remains were put into a coffin. It's in Italian, but the word he uses is coffin. And he says that was by the side of the scaffold. Now let's consider for a moment how carefully Henry has not just engineered this, but how he's overseen every detail of Anne's downfall and her execution, even to the point of specifying the height of the scaffold on Tower Hill on which George and the other men were executed. He's been on top of every single detail. Would he then just think...
Been micromanaging.
Yeah. Would he then just think, oh, who cares about a coffin? Remembering that he has to come out of this looking good. Looking like he was wronged, yes, but he wasn't wrong. Henry's never wrong. So if you want to show that you're this merciful prince, you've gone to all the trouble of getting the swordsman to come from Calais to execute Anne in a more merciful way for whatever reason, are you then just going to chuck her in a box? And what is really interesting that I've been thinking about recently when I saw your question, I was reflecting on it. And I thought, what's really interesting is with Catherine of Aragon. So I think our modern morals and an interpretation of this make us think Henry had Anne executed, so of course he's just going to chuck her in a box because he doesn't care about her. Henry, treated Catherine appallingly, yet her funeral was this incredibly huge, lavish affair. To our mind, that might not make sense. It might be sort of, at odds, but to a Tudor king just in the 16th century, this makes perfect sense because order is important. You have to follow a certain order. So Catherine is buried.
She was still, a royal princess, irrelevant of what Henry may have thought.
Absolutely. She was the dowager princess, according to Henry. So she's buried near the high altar at Peterborough. This is even though he treated her appallingly, he still has to follow this because that's what you have to do. And there's no, I've recently chatted to someone about Catherine's burial, and there's no reason to think that was like, oh, Peterborough. Yes, it was removed from London, but there was nothing wrong with the burial place. And she's buried in a very, high, in a very honoured position near the high altar. So when we think about Anne, yes, she's executed for treason. But even after her execution, she's still referred to as the late queen. She's still given that respect. I don't know why, to be honest with you, but that does continue. So I think we have to consider the possibility that Henry also had, even if it was just a simple coffin, he doesn't want everyone seeing as the ladies take her. I'm just not sure whether he'd want that display that is going to engender pity in everybody watching. If one lady's carrying Anne's head and the other one's carrying her body and they're going to the chapel, people are going to feel sorry for her. This is atrocious. Whereas if there is a coffin, like the Venetian ambassador says, waiting by the side, she's discreetly tucked into it. Maybe, yes, then her ladies carry the coffin to the chapel. There's less of an emotional link with the people watching. I don't know. I think we have to at least consider that it's possible that there was a coffin.
And it doesn't actually make sense when you consider how diligent Cromwell was and Kingston. I mean, Kingston, Anne Boleyn was not the first queen Kingston witnessed die, but by no means the first person he witnessed be executed. No. Kingston would have known that a coffin was needed. So I think we have to probably take that story with a bit of a pinch of salt and think more logically about what would have actually happened.
Yeah. It's just one of those things, isn't it? That we unless we find Anthony's original diary, which would be amazing, and see what else he says in there. But a simple coffin seems likely to me.
Yeah, because even in the when Anne's well, what we thought were Anne's remains discovered in the Victorian era until Alf told me otherwise. But there's no mention in that description about them opening up a coffin. They just talk about finding bones at a depth of 2 feet, don't they? So even that doesn't tell us much. But as I say,
Because I think that material kind of disintegrates, doesn't it, over
yeah,
time?
true, true. So final question is, did Henry later in life ever show any regret in with regard to Anne's execution? Was there any hint later that that he did regret his actions? We know he freely admitted some regret at Cromwell, but
Yeah,
was there anything about Anne?
it's a very interesting question. Nothing comes directly after Anne's execution. We don't have any evidence to say that, a couple of weeks later he was like, oh God, Anne, and the Cromwell thing is interesting, isn't it? Because yes, he does show some remorse, it appears, but the context is interesting because what he's more regretful of is the fact that he doesn't have Cromwell to do the work for him. So,
Yeah,
there's always
yeah,
something
you
with
missed how
Henry.
competent Cromwell was.
There's always Cromwell did the work of 20 men. Of course, he's going to be sad that Cromwell's not around. And there was never another Cromwell. There was no one of that caliber. That just left a huge hole, as Anne and George's execution and the execution of the other men does. The Tudor court's transformed after May 1536. It's just not the same, and it's never the same. I might be biased, but I think, people might agree that it is a different court after this. So no, there's no direct evidence, but I know you recently spoke to Sandra, which is a dear friend of mine, Sandra Vasoli, and she uncovered a really interesting document in her research. So she uncovered a quote by a man called André Thevet, and he was a French Franciscan friar, and he published a world history, and it's called La Cosmographie Universelle, and it's like a French history of the world or something. And it does
Mm.
include an account of Henry's death, a short account, but he actually claims in that several English gentlemen told him that on the king's deathbed, and I quote, the king acknowledged with great grief at this death the injustices he had done to the Lady Anne and her daughter. Now, it's possible that he had some connection to the Franciscan friary of the Observant Friars at Greenwich. I know Sandy thinks it's very plausible and that he may have had the contacts for this to be true. So if this story is true, it seems that at his deathbed, Henry perhaps was reflecting on his life, which would make sense, and acknowledged this. I also wanted to just mention, Adam, quickly the work of Professor Micheline White. So she has done some amazing work, and she uncovered some marginalia in a copy of Catherine Parr's Psalms or Prayers, which Henry himself annotated in several places and reveals a very anxious Henry in the last couple of years of his life. He's worried. There's a lot of things in there that we could discuss, but just to keep it sort of summary and connected to what you asked me, he's worried that he's been sinful, that he's been unwise, that he's been ignorant, and that he's angered God. But he's also hopeful that God's going to forgive him for all of this. So I think this is further evidence that when Henry got really sick towards the end and when he was on his deathbed, he's confronting these issues and he's confronting the possibility. It's a lot about his physical suffering. He's sort of confronting this possibility that his physical suffering is a punishment from God, and it's because of sins that he's committed in his lifetime. Now, again, a pinch of salt is required because, again, we know Henry's a performer, and this is what a good king should do, submit himself to God. And books at the time were not as private as we might imagine. They were read in groups. He knew other people were going to see this. So Micheline White suggests that we have to also look at this as performative, as Henry performing again and doing what an exemplary monarch should be doing. But I think it still suggests that he may have reflected on his life and thought, holy moly, all the people I've killed, what's God going to say when I get to the pearly gates? I mean, I think he may have been a little bit on the concerned side about his immortal soul.
As close to introspective as Henry ever got to. I
think so.
I've actually wondered whether, had they had the chance to be, that Anne Boleyn and Catherine Parr would have probably got along really well. I think of any of the wives, if there had been a friendship that would have worked nicely, I think Catherine Parr and Anne would have been quite close.
Yeah, I thought they would have been a perfect match, to be honest. Perfect in lots of different ways. Yeah.
Well, thank you so much for coming on for a chat. This has been so fascinating to hear your theories and thoughts. And yeah, so where can people find you?
Well, I'm kind of all over social media. So, and thank you. I've really enjoyed this conversation as well. So On the Tudor Trail is my website, but I'm probably most active, to be honest, on my Instagram account. So, if you search Natalie Grueninger, you'll find it. There's also Talking Tudors, a Talking Tudors Instagram account that you can follow. And I have my own Patreon community if people want to support the work I'm doing. Lovely group of people, very enthusiastic about Tudor history. So you can always join the group, and you can join as a paid subscriber or a free subscriber so that you can just see what's happening and what's going on.
Thank you again so much for coming on for a chat. And hopefully we'll see each other in the flesh at some point soon.
Oh, I'm sure you will. I can't stay away for that long, Adam. You know that.
And so that brings us to the end of this week's episode of the Tudor Chess Podcast. Thank you so much for listening, and a massive thank you to Natalie for coming onto the show to discuss her book, The Final Year of Anne Boleyn. Next week, I'm thrilled to be chatting to Ellie Jackson of the British Library. Ellie is the curator who pieced together the remarkable new exhibition, Medieval Women, currently on display at the library, including some incredible items, including Joan of Arc's very own signature. This is definitely going to be a fascinating chat, so make sure you check in next Thursday to hear all that Ellie has to say. Thank you again for listening to the Tudor Chess Podcast, and speak soon.